betrayal during illness, unfaithful husband, betrayed and silent wife. Strong, harsh words that carry the weight of a pain that most people prefer to hide. But this is the story of someone who lived through it. Someone who was abandoned when she needed care the most, and worst of all, abandoned by the one she swore to love and protect him, who ran away with his lover while she was sick at home, and she knew everything, and still remained silent. No one ever understood why, but today, she will tell you. And you may never see love the same way again. She was an ordinary woman, hardworking, dedicated, discreet. She always put others before herself, a present wife, a caring daughter, a trustworthy friend, the kind of woman who, even when exhausted, smiled, who, even when hurt, kept going, who made a lot out of little and a shelter out of silence. Her name? Let's call her Laura. A woman like so many others, invisible to many, but essential in the lives of those around her. And like many others, Laura believed in love. In the love of a man she met when she was young, with whom she built a relationship that lasted for years, a relationship that seemed solid to others, but that inside was already showing signs of erosion. Her husband, Marcelo, was a man with a friendly exterior. He was kind to his neighbors and always had a kind word at family dinners, but he was also absent, cold, and over time, selfish. Laura noticed these changes, but chose not to see them. After all, who wants to see that they are being left out? The routine was consuming them both. He immersed himself in work and his own desires. She was left with the responsibilities of the house, the bills, and life. But the worst was yet to come. Laura fell ill. It started with unexplained fatigue. Then came constant pain, dizziness, loss of appetite. The diagnosis came, an autoimmune disease. It wasn't fatal, but it required care, rest, patience, and, above all, support. Support that Laura imagined she would have, but what she got was something no woman should have to go through. In the early days of his illness, Marcelo tried to hide it. He would call to see if she needed anything, ask how her pain was. But soon these gestures became rarer. The calls stopped. The messages were short, almost cold. He would come home late, sometimes he wouldn't even show up. And Laura, even though she was weak, knew there was someone else. A woman's intuition never fails, and when it does, it's because the pain has already become certain. Laura didn't need proof. She could feel it in the air, in the gestures, in the silences, in the smell of a different perfume on his shirt, in the inconsistent schedules, in the eyes that no longer looked at her. She tried to confront him once. She asked him calmly if something was wrong. Marcelo was direct. He said she was paranoid, that the illness was affecting her mind, that it was better for her to rest instead of making things up. And that was when Laura realized she was alone. From that day on, she decided to observe, in silence, without drama, without shouting, and she began to write everything down mentally. The times he left, the places he said he was going, the clothes he changed, the excuses he made. The mistress was not just a supposition, she was a bitter and living certainty before her. But Laura, even so, said nothing. Why would a sick and betrayed woman choose silence? Why would she bear to see the man she loves sharing his life with another woman while she could barely get out of bed? Maybe out of fear, maybe out of pride, maybe out of strategy, maybe out of something much deeper, an old wound that made her believe she deserved no more. The days went by. The pain increased. And Marcelo simply disappeared for a while. He said he was going away for work, but Laura knew. He had run away with his lover, and she, in silence, watched her own life fall apart. Alone, sick, abandoned. This is just the first layer of a true, intense, disturbing story. A story of abandonment, betrayal, and quiet strength. But it is also a story about decisions. About how far a woman will go to preserve her sanity. And about what happens when silence becomes louder than any scream. In the next chapters, you will hear this story from Laura herself. In detail, in tears, in outbursts. But before that, tell me, what would you do in her place? Would you have the courage to confront everything, even when you were sick, or would you do as she did and remain silent? Comment below. I want to know your opinion. If you've come this far, it's because this story touched you in some way. So like this video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Laura's story will still leave you speechless.
Hello, my name is Laura, and for a long time, I was that woman everyone admired for putting up with everything in silence. The devoted wife, the strong woman, the person who didn't give in. But inside, I was falling apart. I knew everything. I knew my husband had a lover. I knew he lied when he said he was at work. I even knew who he was with, but still, I kept quiet. You can judge me. You may think I was weak, that I accepted too much, that I settled. Maybe. You even think I was waiting for him to officially leave me. But the truth is that I don't even know how to explain why I kept quiet. Or rather, today I know. But back then, I just felt the weight of the world crushing my chest. I was sick, literally. My body was screaming for help, and so was my heart. It all started when I started feeling more tired than usual. And it wasn't just physical fatigue. It was as if every cell in my body was sinking into quicksand. I dragged myself to do the basics. Getting out of bed was a struggle. Eating was another. And all of this without even knowing what I had. I went to doctors, had tests, waited for a long time until the diagnosis came, an autoimmune disease. The name didn't matter much. What mattered was the impact it had on my life. I needed help, care, presence. But all I got was absence. Marcello, my husband, simply disappeared from my life. First, he was late. Then, he disappeared. He made excuses that were poorly told. And even though I was weak, I noticed every detail. The way he avoided looking me in the eye. The rush he made to leave the house. His cell phone was always facing down. The long shower he took when he came back. I knew that man like the back of my hand, and he was cheating on me. And worse, cheating on me while I was sick. There was one day in particular that I will never forget. It was a rainy Tuesday. I was lying on the couch, covered up to my neck, with pain all over my body. I could barely move. He walked through the room as if I were invisible. He said he was going to take care of some things at the bank. He didn't even ask me if I needed anything. He just left, and I stayed there, listening to the sound of the rain and trying to hold back my tears. But at that moment, it all finally hit me. I was alone. After that, I started to observe everything with different eyes. I became my own detective. I didn't need physical evidence. I could see it in the gestures, the words, the silences. One time, he left the car unlocked and I found an earring in the glove compartment. Small, gold, with a red stone. I didn't wear anything like that, but I didn't confront him. I just kept the earring, like someone who keeps a part of their own pain. Another time, I called him around 9 o'clock at night. His cell phone rang and went to voicemail. Half an hour later, he texted me saying he was in a meeting at 9:30 at night. I just said okay, and I was silent, but inside me, everything was screaming. The climax was when he told me he was going away for work for 3 days. He said it was an important convention. He couldn't miss it. He gave me a cold kiss on the forehead, picked up his suitcase, and left. And me? I stayed in bed with a fever, shaking, nausea, and a pain that wasn't just physical. He had run away, and I knew exactly who he was with. You must be wondering why I didn't react, why I didn't yell, kick him out of the house, tell anyone. But when you're sick, everything changes. Your energy goes away. Your self-esteem evaporates. You feel too weak to even ask for help. And deep down, I also felt ashamed. Ashamed to admit that the man I chose to share my life with betrayed me at the worst moment of my existence. Ashamed of having believed so much, of having given so much of myself, and of receiving so little in return. One day I thought about writing a letter, telling him everything, giving it to him, but I couldn't. I tore it up before I even finished it, because deep down, I knew he wouldn't care, and that hurt more than any betrayal, knowing that he simply didn't care. I began to live in a state of numbness. I would wake up, take my medicine, try to eat something, and go back to bed. I would spend the whole day staring at the ceiling, and every time the phone rang, my heart would freeze. It was the fear of bad news, but also the hope of some kind word. But it was never him. It was never anyone. During all this time, I kept up appearances. I posted the occasional old photo on Instagram as if everything was fine. I answered my mother's calls saying that I was slowly recovering. My friends didn't even know I was sick. Marcello had made a point of keeping everyone away, and I allowed it. The lover, I knew who she was. Not because he told me, of course not, but because a woman's intuition is powerful. And because, at some point, he made the mistake of leaving her name visible in a notification on his phone. A name I will never forget. A name that burned like acid in my stomach. But even so, I remained silent. Maybe I hoped he would come back different. That he would regret it. That he would remember who I was. Maybe I clung to a foolish hope. Or maybe I just wanted to survive, one battle at a time. But I knew one thing. One day, he would pay for all that, not with revenge, but with his own conscience. Because men like Marcello think they are always in control, but they forget that time takes its toll, and it takes its toll dearly. Have you ever felt like you were alive on the outside, but completely dead on the inside? That's how I felt. The days passed in a blur, and everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The disease consumed my body, the betrayal, my soul. Marcello was away for 3 days on that work trip. I spent the nights awake, feverish, shaking, with my cell phone in my hands, staring into space, wondering if he would, just once, think of me, if he would feel guilty. If he would remember the woman who, for years, had been by his side through everything. But no text, no call, no how are you. His silence hurt more than any cruel words could. On the 3rd day, he came back. He opened the door as naturally as ever. He was carrying a coffee in his hand and a bag with a book, probably bought at the airport to seem attentive. He kissed me on the forehead, said, "How are you, my dear?" and went to take a shower. I responded with an emotionless "I'm going." Inside, I screamed. Inside, I cried. Inside, I imagined 1,000 ways to end this farce. But on the outside, I continued to be the woman that no one understood, the one who remained silent. That night, lying next to him, I listened to his deep breathing as he slept, and I wondered, how can anyone sleep in peace knowing that he abandoned his sick wife to be with another woman? How can anyone lay their head on the pillow with such a conscience? I spent the night awake, again. But it wasn't just the physical pain. It was the psychological pain, the anguish, the doubt about what to do with everything I knew, but never said out loud. In the following days, I began to notice small changes. Marcello tried to be more present. He made lunch. He brought me medicine. He asked how I was feeling. He seemed kind. but it was a rehearsed kindness, a cheap act. His gaze still avoided mine. His soul was far away, and I knew he was trying to alleviate the guilt, trying to balance the scales of error with empty gestures. One day, while he was taking a shower, his phone vibrated, and for the first time, I picked it up, hands shaking, heart racing. The notification was from an app he said he no longer used. I opened it, and there it was, a conversation with her. There were no nudes, no declarations of love, but there were codes. There was intimacy. There was the kind of care he hadn't shown me in a long time. "Did you get home safely, love?" she wrote. "Missing our trip?" Another message said. He responded with emojis, with affection. It was clear. It was evident. And it was nauseating. I deleted my browsing history and put my phone back. I went to the bathroom and threw up. It wasn't just the disease. It was disgust at the situation. Disgust at myself for living through it. For accepting it. For pretending. That morning, I thought about leaving. I swear I did. About packing a bag, calling my sister and disappearing. But where would I go, sick like that? Who would take me in? How would I stand on my own 2 feet? The illness had taken away my physical strength, the betrayal, the emotional strength. I was an empty body, inhabited by sorrows and medicines. But there was something that still kept me there. Maybe the desire to see how far he would go. Maybe the foolish hope that, at some point, he would come to his senses. Or maybe I just wanted to survive long enough to get out in one piece. The days went on. His mask went on too. We started receiving visitors, family, and friends. Marcello, like a good actor, smiled, offered coffee, told jokes. He said, "Laura is recovering well." Thank God. And everyone believed him. No one saw the dark circles under his eyes, which were not from worry, they were from sleepless nights with another woman. No one noticed my dull gaze, my emotional absence. But there was a moment that almost made me explode. It was at a Sunday, lunch with his family. We were at his sister's house, and one of his sisters-in-law, without knowing anything, turned to me and said, "Laura, Marcello is such a dedicated man. You are lucky to have a husband like that." The sentence went like a knife into my ribs. I smiled. I swallowed hard. I agreed. And in the bathroom, afterwards, I cried so much that I was short of breath because no one knew. No one understood. And I remained silent. It was at that moment that I started writing. I took an old notebook and started recording everything. Not to confront, not to expose, but to keep from going crazy. Writing was my only escape valve. I became my own confidant. I wrote about the smell of her perfume on his clothes, about his lame excuses, about the looks he looked away from, about the disgust I felt when I heard his voice say, "I love you," knowing he was saying the same words to another woman. I wrote about the times I thought about dying, about leaving everything behind, about giving up. But I also wrote about the strength that emerged when I thought I had nothing left, about the desire to rebuild myself, to get out of there, one day, with dignity, with truth. And do you know what's cruel? He never knew I knew. He never even suspected, because men like Marcello think they're good at deceiving. They think they have everything under control. Little do they know they're being watched by silent but watchful eyes. And it was in that silence that I found myself again, at rock bottom but aware. And as contradictory as it may seem, I needed that silence. I needed to go through it to understand who I was, and most importantly, who I never wanted to be again. I started planning, not revenge, but my exit, discreet, safe, definite, And in the next few days, everything started to fall into place. After those days, when everything seemed to be falling apart, I started to think a lot about what I really wanted. I needed to make a decision. I couldn't stay in that invisible prison that betrayal and illness had created around me. I felt like a ghost in my own life. Marcello, as always, continued to act as if nothing had happened. He would come home late, disguise his relationships with his lover, and use excuses to leave without giving any explanation. And me, I put up with it all, wasting away in silence. But there was something different happening inside me. A spark, small and timid at first, began to ignite. It was a desire to stand up, to no longer be a victim, to find a way out, even if I didn't know exactly what it would be. It was then that I began to make plans. Not plans for revenge, not plans for explosive confrontation, but plans for self-care, for rebuilding. I needed to strengthen myself to withstand whatever came. I needed to find a way to regain control of my life. Meanwhile, his presence at home continued to be a mixture of coldness and falseness. Sometimes he tried to be the present husband, but I already knew that it was all a facade, a mask to hide the guilt and the lies. One time, I felt so angry that I almost lost control. Marcello came home smiling and wanting to be affectionate. All I could do was look at him and say, "You know you're destroying me, don't you?" He looked away and responded with a silence that said it all. But it wasn't enough to make me give up. On the contrary, that moment made me understand that I needed to get out of that situation before it destroyed me forever. Meanwhile, his lover remained in his life and, by extension, in my life as well. A presence that I felt even without seeing. Her perfume on his clothes, the smell that made me nauseous, the hidden messages on his cell phone. It was a constant poison that corroded my soul. I decided I couldn't live that lie anymore, and I started looking for help. I made appointments with psychologists, talked to close friends, even if only vaguely, so as not to expose everything, and sought support in groups of women who had been through betrayal. It was a slow, painful process full of doubts. Many times I wanted to give up. I wanted to give in to the suffering, but something inside me told me to keep going, to not allow that betrayal to define who I was. Meanwhile, Marcello continued his double life, unaware that I was beginning to grow stronger. But our home, which had once seemed like a refuge, had become a suffocating prison. Until one day, something happened that changed everything. I found a letter he had left, but not for me, for his lover. A letter full of vows, promises, and plans. A letter that revealed his true face, a man who did not love me, who had never loved me, who had used my illness to walk away and live another life. It was as if the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I cried like never before, but at the same time I felt a strange sense of liberation, because I finally had the proof I needed. I could finally put an end to that chapter of my life. But I knew that wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of my struggle to find myself again, to rebuild my self-esteem, my dignity, my self-love. And I decided that I would no longer remain silent, that this story needed to be told. For me, for him, for the world. The discovery of that letter changed everything. It was the moment when the truth emerged from the shadows and came to the surface in a brutal way. I held that piece of paper in my hands, and I felt as if the world was collapsing around me. Each word written by Marcello was a blow, a deep stab in my already wounded soul. Reading those promises to another woman, those false promises that he didn't have the courage to make to me, was one of the most painful experiences of my life, because it wasn't just the fact of the betrayal itself, but the veiled contempt, The lack of respect, the complete lack of consideration for everything we had built together. But it was also a moment of clarity. I needed to finally free myself from that prison. The letter was irrefutable proof, not only for me, but for everyone who doubted my pain, who judged my silence, who questioned my strength. In the days that followed, I began to organize my life with a new determination. Still sick, still fragile, but with a new purpose to rebuild my dignity, my self-esteem, my life. And that involved leaving that house where lies inhabited every corner by regaining control of my choices. It was a process full of fear and insecurity. How could I leave such a long relationship? How could I start over on my own? I had so many doubts that, at times, it seemed like my body couldn't bear the weight of so much uncertainty. But there was something inside me that said, "You deserve more. You are more." It was a small voice, almost a whisper, but firm and constant. And I clung to it. I began to seek support from professional psychologists, therapists, people who could help me understand what I was feeling, to deal with the pain and guilt that insisted on accompanying me. Each session was a battle, a confrontation with my own feelings, fears, and limitations. And little by little, I rediscovered who I was outside of that toxic relationship. I remembered my qualities, my dreams, what I wanted for my life. It was a silent rebirth, an internal transformation that prepared me for the next steps. At the same time, Marcello tried to get closer. Maybe out of remorse, maybe out of fear of losing control. He said he was sorry, that he wanted to try to start over, that he didn't know what he had done. But I no longer believed his words. I knew that his love was somewhere else, with someone else, and that nothing he said could erase what had happened. Little by little, I began to set boundaries. I denied him permission to enter my new life, to dictate my decisions. I began to distance myself, to protect myself. It was a necessary defense so as not to lose myself forever. But the process was not easy. I had to deal with the grief of the relationship I thought I had, the family I imagined I would build. I had to face people's judgment, inconvenient questions, and other people's opinions. Many times, I felt alone and misunderstood. And it was at that moment that writing became my strongest refuge. I continued writing in my diary, reporting every achievement, every fear, every small victory. Writing was what kept me strong. It was what gave me a voice when I didn't have the courage to speak. Some nights, through tears, I would reread everything I had written and realize how much I had changed, how much I had grown. It was a slow, painful process, but true. I also started reconnecting with old friends and reconnecting with relationships that I had forgotten about. This gave me strength and hope. I realized that I was not alone, that there were people willing to support me and help me move forward. With each passing day, I felt less afraid and more desire to live. I started taking better care of myself, valuing my physical and mental health. I made small changes to my routine that made me feel alive again. But what hurt the most was knowing that Marcello and his lover were continuing with their lives, seemingly without remorse. And me, I needed to find a way to leave this behind without letting myself be consumed by hatred. I decided that my happiness could not depend on their downfall. I needed to free myself from the past to build a future. Still, some nights, the fear and sadness would return. I wondered if I could ever be happy, if I could ever trust anyone again, if the wound would ever heal. But with each dawn, I remembered that I had resisted until then, that my story would not end in betrayal and abandonment, that I was more than that. And so, slowly, I began to rebuild myself. Little by little, my memories of my time with Marcello began to become clearer. not out of nostalgia, but so that I could understand what I had really experienced. When I looked back, I saw details that I had not seen before, subtle signs that were there, but I pretended not to see them. It was a defense, a mechanism to cope with reality. I remembered the way he looked at me when he thought I didn't understand. It wasn't a look of love, but of disguised indifference, as if he had given up on me a long time ago, even before the disease began to consume my body. It was an empty, distant look that I tried to interpret as tiredness or concern. What hurt the most was the way he continued to act as if I were invisible. He would come home late. Sometimes he wouldn't even talk to me. He would spend hours on his phone, hiding messages, turning off the screen as soon as I got close. What was he trying to hide? I already knew, but it was like a part of me still refused to fully accept it. I also remembered the little lies he told to justify his disappearances. It was a last-minute meeting. I had to work late. I had to take care of some things at work. Words repeated like an empty mantra that no longer fit with the reality I perceived. It was a period in which my mind was in constant conflict between what I wanted to believe and what I was sure was true, between the desire to preserve my family and the need to protect myself, between the love I still felt and the contempt I deserved. But at the same time that I relived these memories, I felt a strange force growing inside me, a desire to no longer be fooled, to no longer accept crumbs of attention and respect. It was my body and soul telling me that it was time for a change. I saw myself waking up from a bad dream, from an illusion that imprisoned me, the illness, the betrayal, the loneliness. All of that had been a cruel test, but also an opportunity to find myself again. I began to realize that the silence I had maintained for so long, which to many seemed like cowardice, was actually a form of protection. I needed to preserve myself, to strengthen myself before facing everything head on. It was my way of resisting. But resisting did not mean accepting. Resisting meant fighting, even if in silence. And this fight was far from over. At the same time, I began to understand the role of the people around me. Some distanced themselves when they found out about my illness. Others kept their distance, out of fear or ignorance. And a few remained as pillars of support. It was at that moment that I valued true friendship, genuine affection, and sincere support the most. People who didn't judge me, who listened without criticizing, who were willing to help me rebuild my life. On the other hand, I also saw the cruel side of society, which judges quickly, which blames the victim, which does not understand that not all pain is visible. I, who have always been strong, needed to learn to ask for help, to recognize that I couldn't do it alone, that I needed support to face the ghosts that haunted me. It was a painful but necessary process of self-knowledge, a path that led me to accept my limitations, to forgive myself for moments of weakness, and to understand that it was never my fault. Meanwhile, Marcello continued his double life, as if nothing had happened. The lover continued to be present in our lives like a constant shadow that I could not ignore. And me, I began to plan my exit, not a desperate escape, but a planned, safe transition that would allow me to regain control of my life. I started to gather strength, to look for resources, to prepare myself emotionally and financially for this step. Because even though the disease still weakened me physically, I knew that my greatest strength was in my mind and my heart. I needed to be strong for myself, for who I was, and for who I wanted to become. This inner battle, this silent struggle, was what kept me alive. It was what kept me going, even on the days when it seemed impossible. And so, I went on day after day, step by step, towards my freedom. I never imagined that someone could know me so deeply and still choose to hurt me in the cruelest way possible. What hurt the most was not just the betrayal itself, but the way Marcello destroyed the trust I had in him. How he slowly dismantled our world while I was weakened by the disease. For a long time, I tried to understand what had led me to remain in that silence. Why didn't I scream? Why didn't I run for answers? Why didn't I confront him directly? The truth is that fear dominated me. Fear of abandonment, fear of loneliness, fear of judgment. I had become an invisible person within the relationship itself. I saw people's looks, the silent questions, the veiled suspicions, but I didn't know how to react. I felt trapped, as if I were in a maze with no way out, and every attempt to free myself seemed to take me deeper. But at the same time, I began to notice that there was something inside me that was resisting, a strength that I didn't even know I had. It was as if my body, even though it was weakened, was fighting to keep me alive and whole. And my mind began to clear, showing me that I no longer needed to accept that situation. It was then that I began to question everything around me. The people I considered friends, who visited me and said they were there for me, but who never really asked how I was. Marcello's attitudes, which became increasingly distant and cold. And of course, the constant presence of the lover, who I felt even without seeing her, like a threatening shadow. I began to distance myself, not only physically, but emotionally. I retreated into myself, seeking strength to face the gathering storm. Each day was an internal battle between the pain of abandonment and the hope of a new beginning. But the truth is that the pain was unbearable. I cried alone. I felt a huge emptiness in my chest, and I often wished that it would all end there, that story, that lie could be erased from my past. And it was at that moment that I realized something fundamental. I needed to be my own savior. I couldn't wait for anyone to rescue me, for Marcello to change, for life to be fair. I needed to take control of my story. I began to make plans for the future, even though it still seemed uncertain and scary. I planned my way out of that house that had become a silent battlefield. I thought about how to rebuild my life step by step, with dignity and courage. But it wasn't easy. Every decision was accompanied by doubts, fears, and a deep sense of loss. I knew I couldn't go back, but I also didn't know exactly where I was going. And yet, I kept moving forward, day after day, with small gestures, small achievements. I found myself again. I rediscovered the value of my own self-love, of my inner strength. Looking in the mirror is no longer a moment of pain and shame, but a moment of recognition, recognizing the woman who survived, who resisted, who did not allow herself to be erased. And that was my greatest victory so far, because the real betrayal was not just his, but that of all those who pretended not to see, who judged without understanding, who put me down. But I decided not to be a victim. I decided to write my own ending. even if it was yet to come. And while this transformation was happening, Marcello continued his double life, oblivious to the strength I was discovering within myself. I knew the final confrontation was near, but for now, I needed to focus on myself, on my recovery, my freedom, my truth. And so, I kept walking, one step at a time. I couldn't continue living in that shadow that betrayal had created around me. That heavy silence between Marcello and me wasn't just a void, it was an abyss that grew deeper with each passing day. The words that needed to be said seemed stuck in my throat, stifled by fear and pain. And in that suffocating environment, I needed to find a way out, even if it was still invisible. My health was showing signs of improvement, albeit slowly, and with it came clarity. I needed to regain control of my life, my body, my mind. But how could I do that when everything seemed to be falling apart? When the house that had once been my refuge now seemed like a place full of ghosts. The battle I was facing was not just against others, it was against myself. A constant struggle between the fear that paralyzed me and the courage that was trying to blossom. Marcello, with his attitude of a man who pretends to be normal, continued his double life with that cold distance that hurt more than any open fight. His eyes avoided mine. His answers were evasive. His gestures carried a weight of disguised guilt that I felt in the air. His presence in the house was a constant reminder of everything he had destroyed. But I needed to find the strength to deal with this reality. There were times when anger consumed me, anger at him, at my lover, at the absurd situation I was living in. I found myself screaming in silence, crying in the dark, feeling a sadness so deep that it felt like my chest would explode. It was a silent mourning for the love that was gone, for the family that never existed, for the trust that was shattered into 1,000 pieces. But writing was my only safe haven. On paper, I could express all the emotions I was holding inside without fear of being judged or misunderstood. Each written word was a step towards healing, a way to connect with myself, to understand what I really felt and what I needed to move forward. And in this process of self-exploration, I noticed things that I couldn't see before. Tiny details that, when added together, revealed the extent of the betrayal. Marcello's evasions, the prolonged silences, the gestures that contradicted his words. It was a painful puzzle, but necessary so that I could finally face the truth without filters. Over time, I understood that my journey was not just about pain, but about learning, about the strength that comes from adversity, about the ability to be reborn even when everything seems lost. The silence that had protected me so much was now becoming an ally in my liberation. I began to plan every step of my exit from that false life. I didn't want to run away in a hurry, but rather to build a solid transition that would allow me to regain my autonomy with safety and dignity. Each small decision I made became a symbol of my resistance, of my desire to be the owner of my story. I reconnected with old flames, with friends I had left behind, with the woman I had forgotten. It was like rediscovering a hidden treasure inside me. Each reunion, each memory, each gesture of affection was fuel for my recovery. Still, the path was far from easy. Fear of the unknown followed me like a shadow. Insecurity about the future made me hesitate. Doubts about how to deal with the consequences of betrayal consumed me. But despite all this, I was determined not to let this chapter define my destiny. I knew that the happiness I saw was beyond the pain, beyond the tears and the silence. It was a promise I made to myself, a light at the end of the tunnel that I needed to reach. And so, even with open wounds and a heavy heart, I moved forward. Each day was a new battle, a new chance to rebuild myself, to reinvent myself, to love myself. I would no longer be the woman who suffered in silence. I would be the woman who won, who fought, who rose from the ashes. And with that determination, I walked towards the future I chose for myself, a future of freedom, self-love, and hope. Marcello's betrayal wasn't a one-time blow. It was a cut that opened slowly, like a wound that never completely heals, always bleeding in the quietest hours of my mind. As the weeks turned into months, I realized that the pain didn't lessen, but transformed from a brutal shock to a constant sadness. A sadness that accompanied me even when I tried to smile. The memories were like ghosts that insisted on coming back to haunt me. The sound of the phone vibrating with messages that weren't meant for me. The smell of her perfume permeating the air. The moments when I noticed his evasion, his lost gaze, his monosyllabic answers. All of this formed an invisible web that trapped me, a prison made of distrust and resentment. I constantly asked myself what I had done to deserve this, if at some point, by some mistake, I had not been enough. These questions turned into internal dialogues, into sleepless nights, into silent tears that flowed without anyone seeing. But over time, a part of me began to resist these self-destructive thoughts. I knew I couldn't wallow in guilt. I couldn't let this sadness destroy me. It was a slow and painful process, but I began to understand that the responsibility for his choices wasn't mine. That love can't be forced. And that respect is what sustains any relationship. Even so, daily life together was an almost unbearable challenge. The silence that settled between us was heavy and oppressive. Instead of sharing the pain, each of us seemed to carry our own, growing further and further apart. The words that once flowed easily now seemed impossible to say. It was an emotional abyss that separated us. I felt like screaming, crying, exploding. But the fear of what would come next silenced me. Fear of loneliness, fear of judgment, fear of the unknown. And so I kept silent not out of weakness, but out of a need to protect myself until I was ready to face the truth in full. Meanwhile, life continued its cruel course. Marcello continued with his lover, seemingly without remorse, without looking back. Her presence was a constant shadow, a reminder of what I had lost and what he had chosen. And I had to learn to live with this reality, as difficult as it was. But even in the midst of all this, I began to find small sparks of hope, moments when I felt like I could breathe a little more freely, that I could see myself beyond the pain. The strength that was building inside me was silent but determined. I started taking care of myself again, valuing my achievements, even the small ones, rediscovering old dreams that fear had hidden, accepting that, despite the betrayal, I still deserved love, including my own. It was a path full of ups and downs, where the past insisted on pulling me back, but the future shone like a promise. I knew that I still had many battles ahead, but I also knew that I was more prepared to face them. And so, between tears and smiles, between fear and courage, I got up each day, ready to rebuild the woman that pain tried to tear down, but couldn't. The time that has passed since I discovered Marcello's betrayal has brought with it a flood of complex feelings, difficult to describe for those who have not experienced something similar. The mixture of anger, sadness, helplessness, and, at times, even relief, made me feel as if I were sailing through a rough sea, not knowing where the next wave would take me. It was as if my heart was in pieces, but at the same time, there was a spark of hope that stubbornly remained lit. In the darkest days, I questioned my own strength. I doubted whether I would be able to overcome it all, but there was something inside me that wouldn't let me give up. It was the desire to find myself again, to recover my dignity, and to build a life that was truly mine, without shadows from the past haunting me at every step. The healing process was slow and full of twists and turns. I had to deal with what I felt, accept the pain, and most importantly, learn to forgive, not to absolve those who hurt me, but to free myself from the weight of bitterness. It was a daily exercise in resilience, in which I had to be patient with myself, understanding that scars do not always disappear, but can become marks of survival. In the midst of all this, I began to realize how much I had neglected myself. For years, I had put others' needs above my own, silenced my voice to avoid conflict. And now I needed to learn to put myself first. This awakening was both scary and liberating at the same time. I learned that loving myself was not selfish, but an act of courage and respect. My relationship with Marcello became a bittersweet memory, but also a milestone that taught me a lot about boundaries, respect, and self-love. Recognizing that he chose someone else while I was battling my illness made me realize that I deserved much more than crumbs of attention or empty promises. I started to surround myself with people who truly valued me, who supported me, and who saw my worth beyond my weaknesses. This support network was fundamental to my emotional recovery. Friends, family, and professionals who helped me build a new foundation for my life. I also sought new ways to fill the void left by the betrayal. I discovered hobbies, projects, and dreams that I had left dormant, and which now rekindled in me a desire to live fully. These discoveries brought me joy and renewed meaning to my daily life. Despite the scars I carry, today I feel stronger, more confident, and more prepared to face the challenges that are yet to come. I know that the path is not easy, that there will be difficult days, but I also know that I have the strength to move forward. The past is part of my story, but it does not define who I am. My true identity lies in the woman who chose to stand up, who decided to love herself, and who fights daily for her happiness. And it is with this spirit that I close this chapter, ready to write the next ones with the freedom and hope that I have always sought. I never thought I would get to this point, where all the pain, silence, and fear would turn into something bigger than myself. Marcello's betrayal was not just a blow to me, but a rupture that exposed weaknesses and strengths I didn't even know I had. He ran away with his lover while I was sick, vulnerable, confined to a bed that robbed me of strength and hope. And I knew everything, every lie, every secret, every cruel absence. But no one understands why I remained silent. Maybe because silence was the only way I found to survive. During those months, I lived an internal war, a conflict between the need to scream, to confront, to demand answers, and the deep fear of what that would mean. I didn't want to lose what little was left of my dignity. I didn't want the disease to be the reason for my complete downfall. I preferred the solitude of silence to the tumult of words that could destroy what was still left in me. I needed that silence to preserve myself, to rebuild my soul in pieces, to understand that self-love is more powerful than any betrayal. Little by little, that silence became a fertile field for my renewal. In that empty space left by his absence, I began to plant the seeds of my liberation. I realized that I am not defined by what he did or didn't do, but by what I choose to be from that moment on. The choice to love myself, to respect myself, to rebuild myself with every tear, with every difficult day, with every small step forward. Betrayal taught me the importance of truth, not the truth of others, but my own truth, the one that lives deep in my heart and that no one can take away. I learned that pain, no matter how intense, is fleeting when faced with courage. That forgiveness is not for him, but for me, so that I can release the chains of bitterness and move forward with ease. Today, I am a woman who knows the value of her own love, who understands that happiness is not found in the approval of others, but in inner peace, who knows that the past may hurt, but it cannot determine the future, who chooses every day to get out of bed with the certainty that she deserves the best. And here, before you who are listening to me, I leave a question that I have carried with me since the beginning of this journey. If I were you, what would you do? Would you remain silent? Would you fight? Would you forgive? Would you run away? Or would you stay to reinvent yourself? Because in the end, the greatest battle we fight is the one against ourselves. And it is in this encounter with our own essence that we find true freedom, the one that no one can take away, and that no betrayal can destroy.